Cognitive distortions are ways that our mind convinces us of things that aren't true or accurate. They are irrational thoughts and beliefs that distort our perception of reality, and they often veer more towards the negative side of everything. So there's blaming, black and white thinking, overgeneralization, personalization, catastrophizing, jumping to conclusions, and filtering. They were often developed as strategies to protect us from and to cope with uncertainty and threats of betrayal, abandonment, and rejection. If these are left unchecked, the negative or unrealistic automatic thought patterns can take a serious toll on your mental health, and it can affect the way you make decisions, and they can also start pouring into and impacting your relationships if they're left unchecked. Now, it is very important to develop the ability to step back and be able to observe the thoughts and moods. Becoming conscious and aware is the first step towards change. So let's get into it. Blaming. Blaming is seeing others as a source of our feelings and refusing to take personal responsibility for ourselves. This leads to lack of awareness about how you contributed to the situation. Now, of course, there are situations that aren't necessarily always going to be like, oh, this is your fault. It's a consequence because of what you did. Now, there are actions that people do out there that really hurt and that are really, really like awful and unjust. Not to dismiss any of that. But in circumstances where there is personal responsibility, it's more of a feeling and a mood that doesn't have an exact direct cause and effect from something. If we blame our bad mood on another person when the actions weren't there, the situation didn't necessarily call for it, then that happens. Like in life, not everything is going to be your fault, but for certain, you are always responsible for what you pull from that, if that makes sense. You're responsible for your actions, your thoughts, your deeds. Those are the things you're responsible for. Those are the things that you can't control in the situation. So it's important to be able to differentiate that and to make sure that we don't dismiss the fact that there are some people that do really awful things to one another. So I just wanted to make that clear first and foremost. Now, blaming in this concept will sound like, stop making me feel bad about myself. When it is directly not put there, there's no emotional abuse going on, but it's more of like a circumstance that triggered an insecurity in somebody, and therefore they're blaming that person for making them feel insecure, when it is very deeply rooted into an insecurity. It may even sound like, well, that's not my problem, it's yours, in the other flip of the coin. Or you have just ruined my entire day, when this person didn't contribute to ruining your whole day, because of the fact that it's a weird truth to swallow, but no matter how your day is going, no matter what events may occur, we do have enough power to be able to catalyze a better day for us than falling into a pit of that. But at the same time, I mean, there's degrees of severity into things that can ruin a person's day, but I just want to emphasize accountability here. So holding ourselves accountable for our own actions generally puts us in a vulnerable position, which is undoubtedly a difficult position to be in. Like, we feel uncomfortable holding ourselves accountable. We feel uncomfortable realizing how much power we can have over certain situations. We may not have all the ultimate power, but we do have a significant amount of power of how we perceive the situation, of how we utilize the situation, how we catalyze it to benefit ourselves. And it's a challenge to do that for ourselves. So next time you blame someone, you need to veer into instead acknowledge your responsibility. So your responsibility in the sense of maybe you did contribute to the situation in a very heavy way. Maybe you did point out something. Maybe you pushed some buttons. But also on the flip side of the coin of like, if you are on the receiving end of an ill manner, if you're in the receiving end of a bad attitude or something, just realizing that while it's not your fault, you can be responsible for how you take the steps forward from this point forward. You can be responsible for how you choose to act, how you choose to feel, how you choose to internalize it and perceive it, if that makes sense. I just want to make sure that no one feels attacked watching that part of the cognitive distortions. The other cognitive distortion is black and white thinking. So this occurs when things are polarized, and because of that, there are only two possible sides of outcomes. So it'll be very black or white, all or nothing, right or wrong, good or bad. And this kind of thinking fails to acknowledge that there is middle ground, there's gray areas in this life. Nothing is so simple. Everything has a very gray area, and that may be fearful for some because a lot of people want to be certain that it's this or that. When you need to find peace in the uncertainty that things aren't always going to be as clear. There are in between parts, there are gray areas, there's all of it. There's a huge spectrum of how everything can be and where everything falls. It can be multiple, it doesn't have to be one or the other. It also keeps us from seeing new ideas and from being able to see the world as it is. So the world is complex, it's nuanced and full of all shades in between. The other kind of cognitive distortion that we do is catastrophizing. So this occurs when we project the worst possible outcome to any unpleasant occurrence. We expect disaster to strike, if that makes sense. No matter what, for example, like, okay, here's how the stream of thinking can go with catastrophizing. So you will start worrying about failing an exam. Okay, that's normal. You have your worries, you have your thoughts, you have your anxieties about it. But catastrophizing will be like, you're worried that you're failing the exam, you're afraid that you won't get into a good school, then you won't get a job, then you won't have money, then you won't be able to have your life together, and you're forever going to be lost. That's what catastrophizing is, when your feelings, of course, are very valid, but your stream of thinking goes into a huge downward spiral to the point that you feel like everything is doomed, and you feel like everything is an end-all and meets-all, if that makes sense. That there's just one consequence and that's it, and it's the worst possible consequence in the world, and there's no way out of it if this one thing doesn't happen the way it should. The other cognitive distortion is overgeneralization, and this occurs when a conclusion is made based on a single moment or a single piece of evidence. So these statements often include the words always, every, never, or all. So if you have a failed relationship, let's say you just got through a breakup and you say, oh, this relationship didn't go well, all of my relationships aren't going to go well. Or I didn't find a date on Tinder, I didn't find a date on an online app, so I am never going to find a date on an online app. I'm never going to find a date online. Or one of my coworkers dislikes me, so that means all of my coworkers must not like me. Or damn, I failed a math test, I am never going to be good at math. Those are overgeneralizations. And overgeneralizations are very much associated with post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, and other generalized anxiety disorders. So overgeneralization usually comes from that, and that's where that anxious feeling comes from, because they're afraid that one little circumstance is going to define all of those situations in that area of their life. Personalization is another cognitive distortion. So personalization is when we take things personally. When thinking that others, what their actions and their doings are a direct personal reaction to ourselves. And this can cause us to compare ourselves to others and see ourselves as the cause of something that we were not even responsible for. And for example, if your partner's upset, just upset. Nothing related to you, you know you didn't do anything to upset them, but your brain is going to be like finding that you're going to find yourself thinking, oh man, I must have done something wrong despite having done nothing wrong. Like personalization is going to convince you that it's your fault. That's going to convince you that you have caused something to happen when there is no evidence linked to that. But this is also often linked to people that have a very low self-esteem, very low self-image, and who think very lowly of themselves or undervalue themselves. This will be seen a lot because of the fact that this person tends to blame themselves. It's kind of like blaming, but it's more inward. And it's more questioning and self-doubt involved with it all, if that makes sense. The other one is jumping to conclusions. Now, jumping to conclusions can manifest as mind reading or fortune telling. So what that means exactly is mind reading is when you think you know what the other person is thinking and feeling. You'll automatically assume that you know what's going on in their heads. Fortune telling is when you predict the future and force a negative outcome without evidence, if that makes sense. Like you feel like, okay, the situation is doomed, or this person's not going to like you, and therefore it gives us confirmation bias, subconscious action that happens within you, and therefore your actions or your words are going to cause that very thing that you were expecting. And typically it's a negative thing that you were expecting. It's one of the most common forms of negative thinking. When you do this, you aren't allowing reality to play out the way it should. You're not ultimately allowing life to just flow or allowing things to flow. You're jumping to conclusions and thinking that you have it figured out. And while that's different than intuition, that's different than analyzing a situation, that's different than experience, it's more so, in essence, it's a defense mechanism, really, to make sure that you know the outcome. And if you are predicting something bad that's going to happen, you're protecting yourself from going through that. Or if you're fortune telling and you do that confirmation bias, you kind of do that to make sure that you kind of nip it in the bud before it nips you. And this can be seen, for example, with someone with borderline personality disorder. If they're in relationships and they feel like they don't have stability in their relationships, they will typically leave the relationship first before they are left, and they fear that abandonment. So it's a defense mechanism, and it's something that you shouldn't be hard on yourself about with any of these. As a matter of fact, you shouldn't beat yourself up about any of these. They're normal. You're just trying to protect yourself. It's you trying to protect yourself from those threats out there in the world, and just know that once you're aware of it, you can take the steps to work towards it. So last but not least is going to be filtering. What filtering is that our minds naturally fill out information for the sake of efficiency. So when we engage in filtering or mental filtering, we take the negative details instead of the positive, and we magnify those while filtering out the positives, if that makes sense. So this will be a little bit linked to confirmation bias as well. But it's, for example, if there's a day, you're having a day, and your day's gonna have ebbs and flows. Let's say something bad happened, and you start going into a trail of thinking. And it's not just like, okay, like it's a bad day. It was just a little moment within my whole day, within the whole 24 hours. No, instead, let's say you fell and it was awful and it was embarrassing. It was in public. And then instead, okay, you had that day, you had a good smoothie, you had a good laugh with a couple people, you found a really nice book. But then all of a sudden people be like, oh, well, it's good that you found the book. Cool, that's what happens. But then it's going to veer towards like, no, but I fell. But this happened, this happened. And then all of a sudden, it's going to pour into all of the good things that happen in your day. You're going to start automatically seeking out the negatives within even the most positives in your day, or within the most positive circumstances, and the things that you normally would feel passionate about. But it happened because of that one negative thing that triggered your mind to start filtering it out and start focusing only on the negative. And the more you focus on something, the more it appears. You know what I mean? It's a confirmation bias. It's like if all of a sudden you're thinking about red cars, or you thought about a red car and all of a sudden you see them everywhere, right? The same thing happens with your mind. If you start focusing on that one negative thing out of a normal human experience, but if you have that tendency to filter it out like that, it's gonna have this domino effect, and it's gonna become your constant wiring of your brain. Your brain's gonna be more hyper focused on the negative rather than the positive. And negative filtering is one of the primary cognitive distortions found in people struggling with depression. It tends to be so. They may be experiencing things, they may be in a social event, they may be in something joyful, they may be with family, but their mind is so ruminated into filtering out negative over the positive in their life. Even though life is both, it'll just strictly go into the spotlight of the negative. If you suspect yourself to be engaging in negative filtering, try to examine actual evidence. So again, look at the facts. The facts aren't always going to be positive. It's not always going to be dandy and bright and sunny, but the facts are that there's sunniness in there too. So try to examine that. Find instances that are not all bad, and challenge yourself to be grateful for those situations. So this is when gratitude practice can really benefit somebody, because while their brain is ruminating into negative thinking, if you start practicing gratitude, your brain automatically assigns that to you, and you're going to start seeking out that gratitude. You're going to seek out experiences to be grateful for, just like you would seek out a red car when you're thinking about a red car. So these are just a list of cognitive distortions that we all do. Just remember, it's a defense mechanism. It's your brain trying to protect you from getting hurt, getting abandoned, getting rejected. And it's completely normal. Thank your brain for that. Don't be hard on yourself if you get into that. Just thank it, become aware, and do what it is that you need to make a conducive environment to your growth. Have a great mental health day.